Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on net zero governance in a post-COP26 world. My name's Katrina Heaton. I'm the Stakeholder Engagement Manager for the Supergen Bioenergy Hub. We've got 4 presentations today from Alison Moore, Mirjam Roeder, Joanna Sparks and Lisa Trickett, and they'll all be followed by a panel discussion chaired by Rhiannon Jane Rafferty. For asking questions, I'll post these instructions in the chat. If you could use the chat to post your questions to the panel, and when we open it up, if you want to raise your hand, if you ask questions anonymously, please email them to me, and remember to turn on your mic and camera when you speak and turn them off again when you've finished. So I'll hand over to Alison now for the first presentation.
Thanks, Katrina. I'll just share my presentation. And so, something keeps popping up in front of my share screen. Whoops, that's not sharing, is it?
Not yet, no.
Sorry, let me try that again. Dun, dun, dun.
If you prefer, Alison, I can share them at this end, and you can just ask me for the next slide.
It's just the people waiting in lobby sign keeps coming up over my share screen thing. So when I go to share it, it won't let me there. No, it's not doing it again.
If you close next to the participants, the little cross there, then hopefully it should show for you.
Is that any better? No. Sorry, everybody. It was working moments ago. That's still not sharing, is it?
Not at the moment. Would you like me to share the slides?
There we go. Is that better?
Not. We can't see it yet.
Oh.
Katrina, maybe you share the slides then.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah.
Gotta love tech. Seconds ago, test worked fine.
So, Alison, if you just let me know when you want me to move forward.
Okay, so you're currently showing the first slide, the introductory slide, are you?
Sorry, that's right. Yes. Yeah, first slide.
Sorry. Yes. Oh gosh, we're off to a good start. Sorry about that. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name's Dr. Alison Moore, and as Katrina mentioned, I'm an independent energy researcher and advisor in energy systems governance. But the work I'm presenting this afternoon was actually done while I was working at the University of Nottingham as an energy social scientist and based in the University of Nottingham Energy Institute, where I was co-lead for the Energy Generation and Management Challenge. Moving on to the next slide. So what I'm presenting, or what we're all presenting this afternoon and talking to, relates to the recent BEIS, that is Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy consultation on net zero governance. And we submitted evidence that primarily draws on our experience and expertise in the social, environmental, and economic and governance dimensions of renewable energy, with a focus on our work around biomass and bioenergy, in the case of myself and Mirjam. And so this presentation is going to explore some of the key points from our evidence submission that highlights both governance challenges and opportunities as we strive to transition to net zero in a post-COP26 world. And I'll also be highlighting examples of my social and colleagues' social scientific work that aims to contribute to a better understanding of how incorporating societal views in biomass innovation and governance processes can contribute to bridging the net zero policy gap that has been noted by the Committee on Climate Change. And without societal support and action, net zero risks being an unrealised ambition, and that this policy gap will not be bridged. So the consultation posted a number of different questions that they wanted answering. We were not in a position, based on our expertise, to answer all of those, but the first question and the related sub-questions were particularly relevant to us. And it is these that I'm going to be talking to today. And specifically, these were around what are the key requirements for a governance structure that can deliver cross-government climate action at the pace, scale, and over the duration required to meet the carbon budgets and the 2050 net zero target. So next slide, please. So the first of these sub-questions is, are the government's existing net zero governance structures effective in this role, both in terms of coordination across Whitehall and coordination with the devolved administrations and local and regional authorities? And before answering this, we thought it might be useful to first of all define what is governance, particularly what we mean by governance in the context of our own work. And here we borrowed from Cundill and Fabricius, who defines governance as structures, processes, rules, and traditions that determine how people in societies make decisions and share power, exercise responsibility, and ensure accountability. And all of this includes multiple possible modes of policy and decision making, including hierarchical, market, network, as well as multiple possible actors. And these can be government, industry, research, civil society, market and network actors, for example, and all across multiple levels. And this includes international, national, regional, and local. So effective coordination requires that attention be paid to the dynamic interrelationship between national government and local and regional authorities. Delivering cross-government climate action at the pace and scale needed to meet ambitious carbon budgets and net zero targets will require societal support and action at multiple levels, including individual and community, or net zero risks becoming or being an unrealised ambition. However, the scale of the climate change challenge and the action required for net zero is often perceived as an intangible, distant problem beyond the control of the individual, who may think that their small contribution will not be sufficient, or that it's really not their responsibility to take a lead. So a transition of this pace and scale therefore needs to be led by clear government policy, incentives, and fiscal support commensurate with the scale of the challenge. And this can include support for governance processes at the level of local and regional authorities. In fact, they should include support, as a key barrier to effective and local regional governance is often a lack of devolved resources and skilled and knowledgeable staff to help promote, implement and monitor low carbon energy systems, activities and practices. And this dynamic interrelationship across all of these different things is critical to accelerating the speed and scale of implementation of distributed energy systems across these multiple levels. And later, Joanna will re-emphasize the importance of this dynamic interrelationship of multi-level governance and the role that researchers can play in influencing policy at all levels, reporting on engagement with local and regional projects. Next slide, please. So direct involvement of communities contributes to the successful implementation and social embedding of various forms of carbon reduction activity and practices, including the use of low carbon technologies, the adoption of energy efficiency and conservation measures, as well as shifts in consumption practices and in patterns of mobility. And devolved community carbon governance processes can help to avoid the resistance and protest that the remote governance structures or private development schemes can produce, because they tend to be more inclusive of local people and priorities and therefore more locally appropriate and beneficial. And this helps to render a seemingly intangible, distant problem more tangible and manageable. But it also helps to develop trust through interactions and relationship building between local governance and supply chain actors and community members. So working with communities is typically expected to result in the consensual adoption of sustainable low carbon technologies and services, and the embedding of individual behaviour change and social practices. Next slide, please. So the second sub-question asks what alternative governance structures could be established to coordinate and deliver cross-government action on climate change more effectively. So government arrangements help to shape the design and implementation of regulations, markets and institutions, and therefore shape and influence which actors, technologies, approaches are encouraged or undermined or excluded. And much of the current governance framework is built around the old centralised fossil energy supply system and its powerful incumbent actors. In a decentralised energy system, this emphasis shifts to the demand side, bringing to the fore the people who create demand and the places in which they live and work. And this requires that we rethink the role of people as active users or empowered energy systems, as described by Rikal and colleagues, rather than as passive consumers of energy services and supply. So therefore, governments must shift from top-down, technocratic, centralised structures towards bottom-up, consensual, legitimate change that seeks to give these citizens an active voice and role. Alternative governance structures that are fit for purpose will require institutional reform that focuses on end user preferences, facilitating local markets, open and transparent access to data, greater coordination in and across different levels of governance, as well as long-term policy stability, transparency, and legitimacy in policy making. Next slide, please. But these governance structures must also be sensitive to local context. So bottom-up and end-user social intelligence gathering processes such as the recent Climate Change Assembly UK are vital for ensuring the representation of multiple actors, their voices and decarbonisation priorities and preferences. The Climate Assembly highlighted that social acceptance of some technologies may not be automatic, but contingent upon numerous contextual factors, including cost, performance, convenience, perceptions of safety and equity, awareness of the need to decarbonise certain aspects of everyday life, including, for example, heating in homes, and personal and social judgments about the legitimacy of proposals by more or less trusted stakeholders. And this trust in stakeholders is a really important point, and one that I'll come back to later. And later, Joanna will also expand upon this, the importance of consideration of local context in all energy research, whether it be technical, environmental, social, or even better, interdisciplinary. So moving on next. So the third and final question that we submitted evidence for is to do with what metrics should the government use to measure their progress towards net zero. And here the key point that we want to make is that quantitative metrics alone are insufficient to map and measure progress towards net zero. They're important, but a sustainable societal transition to net zero must also strike a balance between all aspects of sustainability, whether environmental, economic and social. And that balance cannot be achieved through measurement of economic value or environmental impact alone. And these are the most prominent metrics that we see that are helping to determine policy. Instead, we must embrace the diversity of expert and stakeholder inputs, multiple solutions, and non-economic values, all of which are needed for a just transition. And so the key issue of energy or fuel poverty is not something that can be addressed in policy by referring to quantitative metrics alone. There is a huge swathe of social scientific information that explains how energy poverty, for example, is experienced differently by different people in different ways. And so it is the qualitative is also highly necessary to understand there. So equally important is asking these value-based questions about the kind of future society we aspire to. So questions like which renewable resources, processes or products should be used and where, and what are the consequences of using those resources and for whom, which problem framing and assumptions should guide the transition. So a sustainable energy transition means different things to different people, and it is useful to understand the range of different perspectives there. And all of this requires that we include a range of different people in the agenda setting, the research and development, and keeping an eye on who else could or should be included to capture their perspectives. Now, I just want to draw quickly on some examples from work undertaken within the Biomass and Bioenergy Systems area to highlight some of these key points that I've been talking about. So, for example, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, otherwise known as BECCS, is seen as a mainstay of the IPCC and CCC modelling that underpins the 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius pathways that are seen as critical to achieving net zero. However, these modelling scenarios are reliant on the sustainable production and sourcing of biomass that will require strong sustainability governance across multiple levels. And this includes, for example, internationally, to ensure that any imported biomass is sustainable in terms of transport emissions, equitable working conditions, and land use. It also includes nationally in terms of significant investment and policy support to encourage innovation and investor confidence. And again, at the local level, in terms of processing emissions and creating a favourable socio-economic context for farmers to allocate time, land and resources to growing energy crops. Next slide, please. And a key governance challenge is that sustainability impacts tend to be locations specific, so distribution of risks is an issue for governance. And again, in UK modelling of BECCS, this assumes a system of international trade, as I've just mentioned, but this is often presented in impersonal and overarching terms. And so it's important to understand how global networks of trade are linked to local nodes, particularly in relation to impacts and how these are experienced and sometimes resisted. And this can raise really important equity and social justice questions related to where has biomass come from, which regions have borne the negative impacts and which have benefited or important, and all of these are important considerations. And also separately or separating the emission and removal of CO2, which tends to be done both spatially and temporally, further increases the ethical implications in terms of intragenerational justice. And modelling marginal land is another area I'd like to highlight, as this has been a central device for policymakers to quantify how much agricultural or how much marginal land might be available as a resource for which the UK can meet its climate change and carbon reduction targets. Now, here, dedicated energy crops were expected by UK policy and academic modelling to be deployed across large swathes of UK marginal lands in response to farm and market level incentives to deliver on bioenergy policy objectives. However, a former colleague of mine, Richard Helliwell, at the University of Nottingham, back in 2018, his research showed that policy understandings of marginal land based on the biophysical assessment of land suitability didn't map onto the understanding of land held by farmers who were expected to adopt the crops. So here the policy framing of energy crops on marginal land was translated by the farming community into energy crops are for marginal land, but the farmers never considered their land marginal enough, and consequently this policy framing invoked considerable resistance. As a result, policy incentives here either did not acknowledge or incentivize farmers to overcome barriers to adoption arising from farmers' cultural values, farm infrastructures and machinery, and as well as their existing practices. And finally, to conclude, there's no denying the scale of the challenge for net zero governance in a post-COP26 world is considerable. So making such a significant energy system transition is a huge undertaking that will require a multimodal, multi-actor and multi-level governance approach. And social scientific findings that are presented today speak to and are relevant to the Committee on Climate Change's recommendations to Parliament on how to bridge the policy gap, including through developing a public engagement strategy for net zero and increasing resources for local government to support local delivery and governance. And these are all critical elements if we are to get the governance right to deliver cross-government climate action at the pace and scale needed in this post-COP26 world. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Alison. That was really great. If there are any questions, if you want to put them in the chat. If not, I think we can move on to Mirjam. Also, don't forget, you will have the opportunity to ask your questions later to the panel, so either in the chat or actually in person by raising your hand. But I think probably we'll hand over to Mirjam then.
Thank you, Katrina. I just shared my screen, but it seems like it's not sharing.
Sorry, I think I was still sharing at the time, so do you want to try it again?
Okay.
Oh, no, we can see it. Sorry, we can see it.
Oh, God, I shared. Brilliant. Let's try that again, because I couldn't see it sharing, which is a bit confusing, but
we can see it. Thank you.
We can
see it. Yeah.
You can see it. Can you see the right screen? You're not seeing my emails or anything?
No, we can just see the slide.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I had a meeting with a colleague this morning, and while we had the meeting, his computer crashed, and I started feeling like it might be me killing technology. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mirjam Roeder. I'm from EBRI, the Energy and Bioproducts Research Institute, and also the Supergen Bioenergy Hub, where I lead the topic group systems. I will take you a bit to a different story and to a different continent actually right now, because I want to talk about our experience in the Philippines about enabling positive sustainability trade-offs from rice straw biogas. But obviously we talk about governance. Oh, now my screen is not moving, at least not on my screen. I just want to recap quickly what Alison presented around governance, because if we talk about governance, we have to keep in mind that we, in the society, we have different actors who have different interests and different drivers for the things they do, but there are also obviously relationships between these different actors, between different groups. And governance, even though it gives us a conceptual structure and rules, how does that describe how an organization is managed? There are different measures, instruments, and rules which have a different role and impact on these different groups of people. And maybe to add to the brilliant presentation from Alison, laying out governance in a really nice way, is that the different measures and instruments we have also mean a different time frame, because we can have measures which are quite flexible and adjustable to a current situation and allow quick adoption, quick changes, but there are also measures and instruments which have a much longer time frame. For example, policies are not changed in a day. Legal constitutional frameworks are not changed in a day. These changes take longer. And if we go the next step, thinking about culture, informal institutions where we have values, a change in these take even longer. And we have to keep that in mind. If we want to enable change, if we want to have sustainable change, we have to be aware of the roles, the relationships, but also the ability of different instruments and measures we want to implement. So as I said, I want to take you to the Philippines and talk a bit about a project we have been working on there for a very long time now, which is about a biogas pilot plant using rice straw. And the main idea of this project was to develop a community-scale bioenergy system. So to utilize rice straw, which is currently disposed in mainly unsustainable ways like burning in the field, to use that to produce renewable energy. So to have this shift from unsustainable disposal of agricultural residues to improved agricultural practices and to produce renewable energy. And who wants to know more about the project? I think Craig Jameson is in the meeting from Straw Innovations. He runs the pilot plant in the Philippines, so he's the mastermind of this project. And so the idea was to develop community co-designed business models. So not just go in there and say like, we improve energy access, but actually work with the community to design business models together with them. And as Alison already flagged up, to actually address the demand of the people. And with this, we hope to enable positive sustainability trade-offs from the rice straw biogas production. So what we did is we spent a lot of time with the farming community in the location where we have the pilot plant in the Philippines, and which meant discussing with them agricultural practices, their needs, understanding why they do things in the way they do things, but also discussing with them how the system can improve. And based on that, we drafted business models. We then assessed the business models with a multi-criteria framework. And then we took these business models back to the communities and discussed with them how these business models, for example, can work for them and where they see benefit, and not just benefit, but actually where they see themselves contributing or having a part in these business models. So as I flagged, the idea was moving away from current rice straw management practices, which are not necessarily sustainable, to biogas-based business models. And we had different ideas from, for example, using the biogas in farm households to having more a microgrid application where we use biogas for industrial uses, or even as far as then integrating mushroom production, straw mushroom production within the rice straw biogas system. And when we looked at these different business models and tried to understand the trade-offs and the benefits from the business models, first of all, we saw what might not be too surprising is that the biogas business models were more sustainable and more beneficial compared to current agricultural and especially post-harvest practices. But obviously we also saw if a business model changes, these criteria changes. And this is really important because often we have policies which might address a specific point in the supply chain, but that might not fit with the actual business model or has an impact on different practices and different methods or technologies. And as we said already, there are different stakeholders, different participants in bioenergy systems. So on one side, we have the farmers who say, okay, if we have a technology innovation, we want to have a stake in it. We want to benefit from it. But then on the other side, you also have the AD operator who also obviously has a stake in it and wants to have a benefit from it. And for these different groups, the trade-offs and benefits, but also the cost of these business models change. And what you also see is that it's not just the general cost and benefits, it's also for them different criteria are important. So it's really hard to compare to say like, oh, it's beneficial for this group, but also beneficial for this group, because each group has different interests and different drivers why they should or why they're participating or actually not participating. And this is really important to understand these different aspects and these different drivers of different stakeholders within the value chain and the business model. And then as we talk about net zero, obviously, one of the key drivers is always emission reductions, net zero technologies. But this is not the whole story. We also need to consider the cost. We need to consider the impact on the community, on the farmers, on the AD operators, so in terms of, for example, income and employment. And what we did here is just comparing different criteria and the synergies between different criteria. And just to really highlight is that the traditional agricultural systems are low in cost, but they're also having negative environmental impacts. While the bioenergy business models have high environmental impacts. But if we bring in the financial risk into the equation, we see that the bioenergy system also have a much higher financial risk as the traditional system. And that brings in the dimension of economics. We also need to consider and find the right balance and trade-off for a system which will be implemented. So decisions based on different criteria can have very different outcomes. And it's important to see the key criteria from the perspective of the different stakeholders. And also very interesting, when we took the business models back to the farmers, we got very different feedback for the different business models. A lot of energy access talks or research talks about improved energy supply for communities. And when we took the business model with producing just biogas, which can be taken back to the households, the farming community actually said, like, yeah, that's nice, but this is not really what we need, because we have a good energy supply. It's not renewable, it's LPG, but as long as the cost of the biogas is not cheaper than what we have at the moment, it's no point for us. And they didn't want to be seen also just as energy users. For them, it was much more attractive to have business models where they can take part and where they directly benefit from the innovation. So just kind of like taking the step on not just seeing bioenergy as a energy access, energy security measure, but understanding the wider context for an agricultural community, but you could also reflect or translate that to other communities who might have different interests, different needs, different demands, to really understand how bioenergy can contribute to different aspects of their life is really key, and making the community part of the system and not just the user of the system. So just to conclude, from the stakeholder participation, we gained really in-depth understanding of the community needs and the perception, which is key if we want to achieve change, because perception is often based on values, and that is something which is really difficult to change. But it also provided us insights on the benefits for different groups at different decision levels. And it supported the co-design of business models to enable community, commercial, and societal benefits. So not just around net zero, but actually going beyond carbon. Improved energy access, environmental improvement, and socioeconomic benefits are all important, as Alice already flagged up. But the outcome varies from business model to business model. So you're not always getting the same level of benefits in the different categories. And understanding these interfaces between the different aspects is really important, because then there are also different benefits and trade-offs for the different actors. And understanding these different levels and interfaces of decision-making, again, is really important, because that also relates to the relationship between people. It relates to the cost, but it also relates to the time frame and the flexibility of implementation and change. So that's for me, and I hope we have a good discussion later on.
Thank you, Mirjam. That was great. Yeah, it's a really interesting project. So I've posted the link to the paper in the chat if people want to take a look at that. Joanna, over to you now for your presentation.
Great, so I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know when you can see it.
Yeah, we can see it now, thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, so hello everybody, my name is Joanna. I am a Biomass Policy Fellow, so I work with the Supergen Bioenergy Hub and these 3 networks that are shown on my slide here. So my role is to act as a connection between our research community and policymakers who are working on things related to biomass, basically. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is a bit different from Alison and Mirjam. I'm going to talk a bit about what I see as the role of researchers in engaging with policy. And then I'm going to try and take some of the kind of lessons from what Alison and Mirjam have talked about and reflect on how we as people working at the science or research policy interface and researchers engaging with policy can learn from the things that Alison and Mirjam have been saying. So the first thing I want to talk about is a bit of kind of my view on why it's really important for researchers to engage with policy in general. And maybe I'm a bit biased because that's basically my job, but I do think it's really, really important. So there is a huge amount of knowledge and expertise and experience held within research communities. And we're constantly generating new evidence. And clearly that is a really incredible resource for policymakers if they're trying to develop evidence-informed policies. But I think it's pretty fair to say that actually all of that knowledge within the research communities is not necessarily always accessible to those who are, say, non-experts, and that can include policymakers. You know, an academic paper, for example, is written in a very specific way. And I would say, having been a researcher myself, even if you are a researcher but an expert in a different field, a paper can be really hard to understand. So there's a load of knowledge there and it's really useful, but it's really hard to get to. So for me, that is why it's really important that researchers and experts in these areas actually make the effort to talk to policymakers, because doing so allows you to take all that research that you've been doing and have real impact. If your research influences a policy and changes a policy, it's going to have a real impact on people's lives and on the environment and on society. So hopefully that has convinced you all to engage with policy if you're not already. In terms of the role that I think researchers take when they're engaging with policy, for me, a lot of it is about communication. When a researcher is engaging with a policymaker, it's usually not just about kind of plonking your research paper in front of them. It's about helping them to understand the work you've done, helping them to understand how the work that you've done might influence the policies that they're trying to make and what your key messages are. So it's not just here it is, it's a communication exercise, it's a knowledge brokering exercise. The second thing that I wanted to say about the role of researchers that I think is really important is that when you are engaging with policymakers as a researcher, you're not usually just there to talk about one specific piece of research you've done. You're there as an expert in your field, and you are there representing all of that incredible knowledge that you've developed, not just of your own research, but of the other research that's going on. And it's also really important in a lot of cases that the researchers, were kind of particularly academic researchers, when they're interacting with policymakers, are there as kind of an independent source of advice. So that's my general thoughts on engaging with policy. But now I just want to go on to kind of follow that up by thinking about some of the things that Alison and Mirjam have talked about already and how they might help us improve our policy engagement going forward, or inform how we go about doing it. So I guess the first thing that jumped out from Alison's kind of response to the call for evidence for me, which was, I guess, a reminder, but actually reaching net zero is a huge thing. It's a huge challenge and it's a really complicated challenge. And for me, that makes it even more important that we make use of all that knowledge and expertise within our research communities. If we are going to meet our net zero targets, and if we're going to do so in a sustainable and just way, we really, really need researchers and experts in these areas to effectively engage with policymakers and help them develop the best policies we can. So we need to make sure we're engaging with policy if we're working in this area. I think the second thing, which is kind of an overall point of a lot of what Mirjam and Alison were saying, is this need to not have action at multiple levels in society if we are going to meet this big challenge. So we need action at individual levels and community levels, but we also need it at national level. And I think that that can be really important for our policy engagement. Yes, the scale of this problem is huge, and I don't think I'm alone in agreeing with what Alison said, that actually as an individual or a member of a community, it can feel kind of out of your reach to do anything about. So we do need those national level policies, and that means that as researchers and people working at the interface of research and policy, it's really important that we continue to engage with national and international level governance and policy makers. However, one of the really interesting things that I kind of took when I was reading Alison's work was this need for local and regional governance structures as well. We will be more successful in meeting net zero if we have governance and we have decarbonisation strategies that take into account the specific context they're being deployed in and the social knowledge and the values of the people that are there. And what that means is that it's not just about engaging with national policymakers, but actually as researchers, we should be thinking about how we can engage with regional and local policymakers as well, and people in those more local governance structures. I think another thing to add to this, kind of slightly outside the policy angle maybe, is that there are some really great projects and ways that research can work with kind of local communities or regions, and I think they're really interesting in the context of this work. And I guess maybe one extra thing is that if you are partaking in any of those projects, or you're doing research that involves community groups, is thinking about how you can communicate that knowledge to policymakers both at national and regional levels. So kind of coming from this point about needing to have policies or governance structures that take into account the specific context they're being deployed in. For me, one of the things that came out of this was the reminder that as researchers engaging with policymakers, we have to remember that there is no silver bullet and there is no one size fits all solution. It's not, we can't just kind of go in and say my technology, my approach, my strategy is going to solve this. I can get the biggest carbon reductions and so it's sorted, because actually it's a lot messier than that. It's not just about achieving the biggest carbon reductions, it's about how it works for those people. And so when we're engaging with policy, we have to bear in mind that there's no silver bullet and there is no one size fits all. And I think part of this is remembering, even if you work in a very technical area, just remembering the kind of wider framing of your work. Even if you are working in a lab on a technology, the idea is eventually that technology will be deployed in a way that impacts on a community or a society or a person. And so I'm not saying that everyone should be a social scientist, but I'm saying that even if you're technical, I think it's important to remember the people side of things. And this is something that I'm really going to take away from this work when I'm talking to researchers. And then just to add, I think, that's all thinking about people who aren't social scientists. I think for social scientists, I think it's kind of a bit of a call to action that it's really important that we have social scientists and members of community organisations working with other researchers when we're engaging with policy, because it's really clear that we need that kind of information if we're going to tackle net zero. The final thing I'm really quickly going to mention is public engagement. And I think this might seem a bit strange because I'm talking about policy, but I do think it's a really important part of this. So obviously many researchers now are carrying out public engagement activities of one kind or another for various reasons. And that might be writing articles for the media, it might be talking to the media, it might be going to schools or doing public engagement activities like this one shown here. So this is me and Patricia, the director of the Supergen Bioenergy Hub at COP26 in the Green Zone, where members of the public could come along talking about biorefineries and life cycle analysis and things. So a lot of people are doing this, but why is it relevant to this conversation about net zero governance? Well, yes, we've said we need those kind of national level policies and we need governance structures, but we do need action across society. So I think it's really important that researchers share all that information and knowledge, not just with policymakers, but with people, with society, with the public as well. So this can inspire individual and community level change, but it also allows people to make informed decisions about maybe what's right for their community or what they're going to buy. And by helping people make informed decisions, it will impact markets, it can impact companies, and it can actually impact policy, because it does matter to policymakers what people think and what the public think. So yeah, I would really recommend, if you get the opportunity, to go and do things like that. And I guess the second point I want to make is that I don't think this is a one-way thing. It's not about researchers going and just being a really clever researcher and giving all their information to the public. This is a two-way exchange. You can learn a huge amount about going and talking to somebody who doesn't know anything about your research, because they're going to ask you questions that an expert in your field wouldn't ask you. And so I think you can learn a huge amount about going and talking to different people in your community and your society about the sort of research that you're doing. So yeah, if an opportunity to do this comes up, or if you have an opportunity to get involved with something like the Climate Assembly that Alison mentioned earlier, I would absolutely leap at it. So yeah, in summary, I think please all engage with policymakers if you're working in areas related to net zero. Carry out cross-disciplinary research, talk to social scientists, talk to people in your communities, and try and engage not just at a national level, but a regional and local level as well.
Thanks, Joanna. Yes, some very important points raised there as well. So now I'm going to bring in Lisa Trickett, and I will share your slides, Lisa. So hopefully you'll all be able to see that.
Thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. So I'm Lisa Trickett. I'm co-founder of Places in Common, a cooperative that works in the field of public policy and change, with a particular focus on climate action and community wellbeing. So in many ways, what you will hear from me will echo some of what you've heard from colleagues on the panel. It will also comes from another sort of hat I wear, that I'm actually a city councillor, and I am also, I've been chair and now vice chair of the Combined Authority, West Midlands Combined Authority Overview and Scrutiny for a number of years. So I've seen it both in the side as a professional politician on how some of the governance challenges in and around driving forward on net zero really hit us. So I think where we actually start from is what we have to start doing is actually collectively owning the challenge and accepting we're living in a very different context to the one we may have been operating in when we first started either our research or our policy journey. And I think if COVID has shown us anything, is that actually the only certainty we currently have is uncertainty, and we need to actually look and learn how we can operate in an increasingly uncertain climate. And when you look at a number of public policy responses, specifically say around procurement, regrettably what procurement doesn't actually enable is that living uncertainty and that dealing with complexity, because there is almost like a presumption at the start of a process you can determine the absolute outcome and the deliverables remain constant. And what we do know is in the sheer complexity of a climate challenge that actually will impact across all spatial scales, all spheres of governance, there is not that degree of control. What I think we also to reflect on, and again colleagues have touched on this, is that we have inherent contradictions and conflicts in the system. Very simple one is currently all subsidy is actually in favour of fossil fuel rather than renewables, say. But also, as somebody who has seen the impact of government cuts on public services over the last decade, there are built-in contradictions, be it the housing system and its impact on retrofit, that will actually conflict with some of the directions we would wish to go if we were to drive forward quickly on retrofit. And again, that term quickly is there. We absolutely know that what we do and what we achieve in terms of taking us forward on a transition pathway will actually determine that the child who's in nursery today, whether they have a secure adulthood. So we have to remember that actually we need to be moving forward now and actually reflecting back and changing as we go. And from both a policy perspective and a research perspective, that is very different. And again, it requires us to look at the way we do our research and our policy and define our governance in a very different way. What we also need to understand is that making some of our approaches, and again, knowledge you hold, and the knowledge we hold in this region on energy systems, some of the work that we see going on is absolutely awesome. The difficulty at times is it doesn't feel rush, it doesn't act late, and it's not relevant to some people's daily experience. And again, from just a purely engagement point of view, there is no point me going out there and talking about climate change to a deprived constituent who actually has to deal with whether they should heat their home or feed their kids. What we have to do is find a way of describing the challenge of net zero in a way that is rational and relevant to the people we meet. And again, Alison referenced this right at the very start. We have to be very careful that we don't actually have the climate challenge and the transition to net zero as the next Brexit in this country. We have a real risk of a triple jeopardy of those who did not cause climate change and the need to change actually being the ones who will pay for it and be the ones who are least protected against its impact. And already, if you see some responses, I bear the scars in my own ward in terms of low traffic neighbourhoods, moves to actually restrict people's abilities to drive a car or do what they want with the waste is having significant fight back. Next slide, please. One would say that the existence of climate change in itself would be enough reason for governments to the way they sustain and develop their economies. But if we just take this to a very local level and look at Birmingham, this is Birmingham's map of the deprived from 2004 to 2019. What that actually shows is in that 15-year period, although there had been significant government investment into the city and region, although it was seen to be an unprecedented time of growth for Birmingham in terms of inward investment, we saw change in the patterns of inequality in our city, and indeed some became more embedded. And what we're arguing there is that when we talk about fair transition or just transition, you actually have to arrest decline, and we have to really understand what drives communities who are so deprived. Next slide. Next slide, please. So of the key areas that we need to understand is when people talk about the transition to net zero, there is quite often a technical assumption that the technology can address it. But in creating a policy system, what we actually have to do is balance the impact upon society, the impact upon the economy, and also this really awesome thing about the need to act now. And again, in some areas, in some economies, that is going to be a lot easier because levels of inequality are not such. In a city or region like Birmingham and the West Midlands, our room to manoeuvre on that drive to net zero is extremely constrained. And what we are saying here very much is that what we need to have is place-based understanding across all spatial scales, across all spheres of governance. And what we really need to do is to understand the context of the places that we're engaged in, what's distinct and different, the systems and how they connect. You can't talk about a housing retrofit purely in an energy system context without understanding what's wrong with our housing system. And what we also have to absolutely get to the bottom with before we develop any system of overall local governance is what drives people. Ultimately, climate change is caused by humans, and it's human behaviour and the behaviours that we have in our respective roles when we go about our daily business that will help inform and shape that policy. We are saying in the work that we're doing, and we've recently completed an Innovate UK project around prospering out of the energy revolution, we're very clear that we need to have that deep ingrained understanding of respective drivers of the key agencies across a range of spheres of governance. Next slide. So what this really points to is I'm now probably long enough in the tooth that I just about probably I had a career in local government some years back. I got into local government when it was still the case that the council be in control. There was areas of its stock or its assets that it could absolutely control and didn't need to work with anyone. Or in terms of regeneration, it would go into a broader partnership. What that meant was that you could create a joint venture, you could have some stability in terms of your partnership arrangements. If you are saying all we have is uncertainty and actually very little control over the outcomes, then what we have to do is start to actually flex our governance and our policy development to actually reflect our reality. And our reality is, yes, distributed control and ownership, and equally the need for iterative policy development. And that requires forms of governance and types of governance that are very different to what we're familiar with now. And equally what that forms is a challenge to the incumbency, because in many ways you see it already. A number of the big corporates have done very well out of the system as it stands, and actually seeing some distribution of that power is not what they're going to want. Final slide, I think. So I'm making a very brazen statement there that the current system is not fit for purpose. Not necessarily my view. I'm sitting on a heat commission St John Armit is chairing, and I have never been in a room with people from Ofgem, people from BEIS, people from CADA, WPD, where there is total agreement that actually the system as we have it is not working. And my dog is now creating a noise. What we don't seem to have, though, as yet, we all say we want to move to net zero, but what we do not have is that clear shared purpose between us as to what we need to arrive at, the mission that we actually need to understand how we can collectively share our knowledge. And what we actually starting to need to look at is a process where that we broker through that understanding. We gain the common purpose, we understand what data we actually need to do that and how we actually have to behave with each other, because it will require a very different way of working to one that we previously known. And then I think my final point, because I will be out of time, what we absolutely also need to understand is it's very easy to fall into assumptions, and certainly quite a few BEIS programs will do this, in that there is a market-led, there is a consumer response. The difficulty we have is actually that is not going to work across the board. Yes, there will be able to be a market response, and we have been there. We have been there in various sort of different schemes, but there is equally the need for that collective response, the place-based response, and there will also need to be that citizen response, that issue about people's rights to warmth, their rights to food. And what we're saying is we need to actually ensure that across our governance and our policy, we're very clear who we are approaching. What is our approach to market? Is it through a consumer? Is it through a collective, a collaborative, or is it on a rights-based approach? And only when we've got that will we actually start to move forward on our transition path. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much. And sorry about my dog.
Thank you very much. Again, some really interesting points there, as Patricia mentions in the chat. Really interesting about the triple jeopardy framing and who pays. So at this stage, I'm going to bring in Rhiannon Jane Raftery, who herself is very involved in community action and engagement, who will share the panel discussion and Q&A with all of our presenters. So if I can ask anyone who wants to ask a question or just make a comment, either to pop it in the chat and Rhiannon Jane will read that out for you, or to raise your hand and we can come to you for your questions. So I'll hand over now.
Right, I can see quite a few raised hands, but I can't see who they belong to at the moment. Hang on. So shall we start? Katie Lamb has her hand up. Do you want to ask your own question?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me okay, first of all? Great. First, I just want to say thank you all for a great set of talks. And I'm Katie Lamb, currently working at the University of Sheffield in circular economy research and with the UKRI Circular Chemistry Hub, which looks at making the chemical sector more circular, but of course ties in with a lot of net zero stuff. So I have two questions, if that's okay. One's more on Alison's talk, but I'm happy for everyone to answer it. And the second one's a more general question. So I was very, very pleased because I've had a look at your consultation document and I agree that in terms of your metrics question, that yes, we do need to look at environmental, economic and social factors. And we agree with you at our centre as well. And we've done a few case studies into measuring all three at once, but I was just wondering if you as a centre had any ideas how you could achieve measuring all three impacts or metrics, I should say, at the same time. So that's my first question, directed more to Alison, but everyone as well. And my second one is, I've not been in policy work long, but a common theme that comes up is two people I think can get bogged down with this idea of, right, we've got our evidence, we've set our policy, we've talked to everyone, we think it's great, set it and that's it, we're done. But actually, you have to always keep changing, updating your policies. And one question that keeps coming up therefore is, how do you truly measure the impact of any policies that you have set so that you can inform new ones that come out of it? So you avoid that problem of setting your policy and just saying, right, that's done, we've solved the issue, but you measure the impact of it and use it to inform new ones. So to summarise, first question, how do you hope to measure the environmental, economic and social metrics in general? Do you have any case studies or examples? And secondly, how do you measure impact of policies? Thank you.
Sorry, how to measure economic, environmental and social impacts? Yes. Or?
Well, metrics, impact.
Metrics, that's right. Yeah. Sorry, metrics. Well, the obvious answer there is to engage in an interdisciplinary research approach, which I'm very pleased to see that UKRI is moving more and more towards with a lot of their research projects and programs, which is very encouraging as an interdisciplinary researcher. But of course, there are different ways of doing interdisciplinary research, and it's not just about each of the individual skill sets or expertise sets working independently of each other. It's making sure that there's a constant dialogue happening even in the proposal writing stage as to how all of these things might fit together and inform one another's work, and they must inform. So these things, if it is truly independent and the metrics that are being gathered change the ways in which researchers think or approach their own work or consider their findings, then you're being successful. But if everyone's just kind of still quite blinkered into their own particular research skill set or lane, and independently getting on with their own thing, then I think that's quite clearly hasn't worked as well as it could. And of course, the best way of doing this is there are key methodologies used by technical researchers as well as social, economic and environmental researchers, but there can be considerable overlaps in how these are done, and the sequencing of how they're done is equally important, particularly if they're to inform one another or change how you might understand the data or the findings that you get. So it's about thinking through the best ways that they work with one another, when in the research process they should be used, how they should be used, and they shouldn't just be applied. But so, for example, if you're doing public engagement or community engagement, it shouldn't just be the social scientists that go along and do that. All of your research team should get involved in that process. Obviously, and likewise, your social scientists should be invited into the lab to talk through how things are working, because they might be prompted to ask questions about why you do things in a certain way that you might otherwise not have thought of. So it's a collaborative process, but it's a continual collaborative process. And I know that's a very kind of general way of discussing it, but I think that kind of gives you a broad overview of how one might go about combining all of those different metrics in a meaningful way.
Maybe I can come in here as well, if that's okay.
Please do.
Because the question you asked, I would ask, how do you measure sustainability? Because these are kind of like the key aspects of sustainability. And we have done quite some work in the Supergen Bioenergy Hub in trying to model sustainability. And while you have different metrics for different criteria and aspects, which is absolutely key, because you can't use the same methodology and metrics you use for greenhouse gas emissions as you would use for energy access or energy security, or revenue for a company. It's about understanding the interfaces between the different metrics and between the different criteria. And obviously, building these relationships is really complicated, because then again, you have different actors, different views, different drivers with people and interests, which will change the weighting and importance of these different aspects and criteria. We have developed quite a comprehensive and big sustainability model in Supergen, which is focused on bioenergy, but can easily adapt it to other disciplines aspects. But the key thing really is what Ella said. You need to work interdisciplinary, because the information which goes into the model and on the metrics and understanding what you do comes from different disciplines and different researchers who are experts in their bits. It also comes from the public, who tells you about how relevant a specific criteria is, or a policymaker or industry who says, okay, greenhouse gas emissions are very important because that is the main criteria of policy, where I get my subsidies from if I hit the right benchmarks and thresholds. While they also said, yeah, but I also want to sell my product, so I need to attract the consumer. So really understanding these dynamics is key. So it's not just the metrics as such, but it's really the interfaces, and that's where you get into sustainability, system modeling approaches.
If I could come in, I think there's a number of important points being raised there. Firstly, one of the things that we've developing as part of our work around Tyseley Energy Park and the development of the net zero pathway in East Birmingham is something called a community learning process. And that is about creating a space where communities of place, practice and interest can actually come together and have the honest conversation. Because what you can find is you can do a really great piece of research and you go down in a particular direction when it's quite clear that somebody who holds a key part of another system is never going to align with your thinking. And what we're trying to do is through a series of immersive events, so COVID's not exactly helped, but taking people out into places so that instead of just reading a piece of paper, you can actually see with your 5 senses. I've got people proposing to retrofit properties where when you walk into them, they are so obviously unfit, that's so poorly managed that you actually have to think about a core service before you do that. So very much we tend to follow sort of theory U thinking about the importance of immersive practice, the importance of using the 5 senses, and also the importance of stories. Because again, if you're wanting to engage with the public hear and respond in stories. And it is much easier to gain people's trust and bring people on side if that story can relate. And what I would say, in just as a final point, is we have to be really wary about metrics that we use to, again, it comes back to that point that you could measure and you could really move forward quickly on something that took a huge part of an area into net zero, but that could bankrupt a whole load of businesses or could actually be absolutely detrimental to the local hospital because they can't then fulfill what they're set out to be. So it is the sheer complexity of how all of this meshes about. So again, one of the areas that we talk about is the need for deep dialogue, deep democracy, because what we're actually doing is a reconciliation process. And what we have to that, and again, the reconciliation is we're going to fail. You cannot move as fast as we're going to have to move without failing. But what we need to create is the honest space where failure is taken in as part of a learning process. And that's very much why we reference community learning as part of the transition to net zero.
Does anyone else want to add anything? Okay,
that's great. Thank you all. Thank you.
I think we haven't responded to the question on how to monitor policy impact though.
So I've just realised I don't want to take up too much time. So by all means, if you want to do, but if there's anyone else pushing to ask a question, whichever you want to do, that's no problem. Thank you.
I can't see any other hands. Is there anything in the chat? Because I can't see the chat and the hands at the same time. No. So is there anyone in the panel wants to address that?
I have a question for the other panel members, but I don't know what Mirjam was going to say. I just interrupted you. Sorry.
You go ahead, Jana.
I was going to ask a question because I think what I've found really valuable about today has been the kind of different areas of kind of experience that we've got talking about these things. And so, you know, in my presentation, I kind of gave what I think about the way that researchers should be engaging with policy and the lessons from this. But I would be really interested to hear from all 3 of the other panelists, if possible, of like any of their kind of recommendations for researchers based on the conversations we've been having today, and whether that's engaging with policy or how to kind of frame their work in terms of society or work with people in different communities, whatever your thoughts are.
I'm happy to step in there quickly because I'm sure my colleagues will have some quite thoughtful responses. One of the challenges is I am very clear that within our research community, we have fantastic knowledge and we have an ability to focus down on particular areas that can address some really complex societal challenges. What is very difficult is people's behaviours, and certainly what is many leaders feel that what they need to do is have the answers, when actually one of the arguments I have is a good leader knows the right question. And I think as researchers, what you need to try and do is, rather than telling people your knowledge, is first of all help them ask the questions, because if they ask the question, they're going to hear your answer a lot better than if you're giving it to them directly.
I couldn't agree more, because that's the whole point of community engagement and finding out what actually the societal needs are for the research we do. Because I think one of the key problems which emerges quite often in research is that researchers tend to sit in a bubble and think, oh, there's a really big technical, engineering, economic, or even societal challenge, and they try to find ways to address it, but they forget that they actually have the responsibility to do that with societal impact. And if it is of no use for anyone, and Alison and I had in the past lots of discussion about this, that especially technology innovation, especially working in the global south or with local communities, if you don't understand the community demands and needs, but also perception, you will never succeed in implementing innovation, but you will also not succeed in implementing behavioral change, because we know we need to reach net zero very soon. We have about 7.5 years to get our emissions down to stay within 1.5 degrees, which is literally no time. That's a blink of an eye. And that is not happening by technical innovation and engineering and policies. It's happening through behavioral change. But how do you change behavior in such a short time frame? And this is really where you need to get people on board and understand what their needs are. And Lisa put it quite nicely in terms of the community needs. And if you change something in a system, it has an impact on people. And you need to understand that impact. And this is really key, because we have this responsibility as being clever people and wanting to develop and design something to actually work with society, because we're also part of society. You know, it's not just about us being middle class white people or middle class people in general to think like, oh, this is needed. No, it's not. It's needed what the community needs, and they sometimes need the support in terms of how to change behavior and how to do it in a way that they are that's acceptable for them as well.
I would just like to concur with both Lisa and Mirjam that question framing is absolutely critical. You can't possibly walk into any situation with community groups, especially in other countries, and hope to understand that you know, or with a level of understanding of what it is that they need or even want. And so it is a question of the community engagement, energy community engagement that I've done, particularly in the global south, is we often don't start with questions about energy at all. It's about livelihood priorities and preferences. It's trying to understand their daily lives, their aspirations, the priorities that they wish to see instigated. And then when you begin to see those emerging, what is evident is that energy is at the core of delivering almost every single one of those in some way or form, whether it be in form of a technology or an energy service as well. And so then you can begin to kind of borrow down and understand where the necessary trade-offs will need to come in, because you can't do everything within the context of your particular project. But it's trying to kind of get a sense of what their daily lives entail, what they don't want to change, but what they do want to change. And that will be different for different groups within those communities, whether that's by age or gender or different interests, for example. So it's really important not to go in with any preconceived ideas about what they need or want, or any assumptions about how you might do that. It's by opening up a very broad dialogue and conversation, and then identifying the energy needs within that and narrowing that conversation down over time to really understand their energy needs, and then how those might be delivered in a sustainable way. Because there will obviously need to be some trade-offs, and so that's where you need to get a more focused idea of what the role that energy plays in their daily lives.
Has anyone else got anything they want to add to that? Are there any other questions? Anyone want to raise a hand? If not, I've actually a question I'd quite like to ask. It's addressed to Lisa. I was interested in what you said about how we must avoid climate becoming the next Brexit, because it's something that concerns me a lot, given I work largely with those whose voices aren't heard. And I wondered how you see the approach in the communities you work in Birmingham, to doing that kind of behavioural change at that, in communities where energy is more about can we afford heat or can we afford food, than actually what kind of energy we're using, and how you see the role of community energy programs helping with that.
Okay, thank you. Some really...
Sorry to throw that at you.
It was quite a wide-ranging one. I think, I mean, what was really interesting is the point about the farmers is the same about point made by residents. If there is to be a huge change, a huge transition, they want to actually participate in it and be part of it. So actually one of my points is community energy schemes are really, really important, because actually it's through something like that that you can give a payback to the community at the start. So before you talk about the electric car, can you actually do something that keep their community centre going? Or, you know, so many people talk about street lighting and their concerns about their space outside their properties. You know, start to look at a way that you can actually explain energy. I'm a politician, so I will never miss a crisis to see it as an opportunity. And I think the energy crisis currently is going to be really interesting, because I will be campaigning, I'm up for election this year, I will campaign on the energy systems not working for you or the climate. And it gives me a real opportunity to talk climate into some of the poorer households in my ward who would never really see the two latched together, because again, we don't see that meter and that bill that comes through the door as related to this big thing. I've actually done focus groups, and people do not understand that energy relates to this thing that David Attenborough goes on about. So actually they don't even understand the fundamental things that need to get changed. I think the other issue is, and I have a massive argument with a number of my colleagues on this, but it's certainly one of the reasons we set up Places in Common was almost the bear witness issue, was that we've got to be honest with people. And at the moment, we are in the city and region I work in, and other parts of the country I'm working in, automotive industry is a key area. And we keep on talking about the green industrial revolution. Birmingham was at the heart of the first industrial revolution. Let's be at the heart of the next one. When you add Brexit, automation and low carbon and the shift to electrical, where you have 40% less parts in an electrical car, onto our automotive industry in this country, you can safely say there will not be many jobs left in it within the next 5 to 10 years. So what we should be doing is having that directional engagement now that is not at the point of crisis, but actually these changes are happening, whether we like it or not, they're happening. They're going to impact on you. These are the jobs that will go, these are the jobs that will grow, and these are the areas we can repurpose. How do we then build it? And so to me, the engagement has to be around that transition pathway, but starting at a point and a place where people are at. I hope that answers the question.
That's a really good answer. I'm going to hand back in a minute to Katrina, because I see we are in danger of overshooting if we're not careful. But does anyone want to add very quick?
Sorry, I just had a question of my own, but Alison, please carry on.
Just wanted to add quickly to Lisa's really brilliant point about the governance is just very much about creating new opportunities and new skills that we need to drive this transition and to make it sustainable. It's not just about the technologies. And she gave the excellent example of the automotive industry in and around Birmingham. And I see a similar thing up here in Cumbria, where I'm based, with the proposals for the West Coast mine, because that's seen to bring jobs and much needed industry. And they're used to that kind of industry in this area. And the lack of green skills training and job opportunities is one of the key reasons why a lot of people are in support of the mine, because they see it bringing much needed jobs, rather than linking it to the transition that we need to make, which requires some very tough decisions. And so we need to be mindful of the broader role of governance around other than just technology.
Sorry, I just wanted to come in. We talked a bit about place-based solutions, and I just wondered if any of the panel had any thoughts on how best to share and scale up successes from the local level to have a wider impact. So if something's gone really well locally, how do we ensure that that has an effect globally, if not nationally?
I might just jump in quickly. I think what we're seeing at a national scale, which I think can be translated to a regional, local level scale, is the benefit of having demonstrators. And I think if you have a successful community energy scheme, and there are numerous ones operating already around the country to do with hydro, to do with wind, to do with all sorts of renewable energies, but it's getting the message out about those schemes, but also making them open and using them as examples for other community groups to come in and learn from these successful schemes. Obviously, there will have to be some differences according to the local context in which they're going to take that learning and try to embed it elsewhere. But I think people really gain a lot from seeing something working in situ and understanding how it got up in the first place, and the community drivers behind it and how they're able to sustain it. So I think that's something really important that can be used across different levels, not just at a national level.
So just to really pick up on that point, I think what we have, I always worry when I hear pilots, because I can go back in various parts of the country and see pilots that were done 20 years ago and they have never been scaled up. So actually understanding how you're either scaling or replicating at the start is at least having that in your framing. I think the important thing is that we get caught up in the sort of idea that this has to grow, when actually it's possibly the process. And it's the depth through a demonstrator. What did we learn? How did we frame the questions of each other that actually got this successfully to stage? What were the key behaviours between people? So if somebody was to ask me, why has stuff around Tyseley Energy Park worked in Birmingham? What I'd say is there's probably 5, 6 of us who've been with it for 10, 12 years. We've taken huge professional risks. We've put a lot of personal time in. There's each of us have got some skin in the game, which means that we've hung with it even when it wasn't the sort of light shining on it. And you can't necessarily translate that, but you can find it. You can find those similar relationships in a locality. So one of the things, again, as part of the community learning process, what we were trying to develop is these kind of understandings of what are the building blocks to scaling up and replicating. But to be honest, a key issue is not having so many damn stupid government funding schemes that set you off running in all kinds of directions. You know, if devolution means anything, then we should be having actually the ability to develop our transition plans for our area and bid in for the levels. If we've got to bid in for the levels of subsidy, I'm much happier at the moment where we're looking at working with the Green Finance Institute, and we're looking at our existing assets and how we can co-finance different elements, because we've just felt that this running after different sources of government finance have actually wrapped us up in knots and hindered our scaling up.
Yeah, I think building on that, it's really about sharing best practice, but then also enabling developers and projects to scale up or to be transitioned to somewhere else, and that needs some form of investment and funding. And it comes down to when we talk about policies and how flexible or not flexible policies are. And if they're focused on a very specific thing and are not able to adapt, to change, to experience, and to innovation in a way that actually helps people instead of hindering innovation and translation into other areas, but also scaling up.
Thank you very much. Friend Jane, I don't know if you wanted to add anything for the end of the panel discussion.
And I think that was really interesting. I can see sort of opportunities for future events around some of these issues we've raised, especially around the whole area of the just transition and how we get there. I think that's a critical one to actually achieving this within the small time we've got left.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, so I just want to thank all of our presenters and also the panel chair. I think that's been a really useful and interesting conversation. I've put up our the contact details there for the Supergen Bioenergy Hub. You can follow us on social media and just please get in touch if there's anything that you want to talk further about. But on that note, I'll say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.